This is dedicated to Keith G Vinal. Born April 12, 1905, and he is now resting in peace since 2009, August 24th. Look up at the stars. The Milky Way and our galaxy are increasing their motion in our universe. Our solar system is increasing its momentum, even as we speak. The orbit of the Earth is at the apex of its proximity to our Sun. The Sun and the Earth electromagnetically communicate with each other. This Earth orbit proximity to the Sun is a 10,000-year event. The Hopis call it the Great Year. They count 4 great years. The Chinese have 14 great years, 140,000 years. Oddly enough, the Mayan calendar is involved at this juncture. 2012 is a possibility on the way to happen. One of the universal theories is total chaos and the end of space-time and the end of the universal space-time continuum. The other possibility is the instant karmic evolution of the human race, a metamorphosis into a higher level of humanity. 2008 is also considered as an epiphanal occasion. We are all on this path together. Hasta la vista, via con Dios. I'm going to start with some of the information I got from Keith's sister in the Vinyl Haven Island off the coast of Maine, Penobscot, Maine. In the north is a smaller island. Dad came to Butte, James Vinal, in 1894. Shortly thereafter, Rail Drive established a practice. Les Mather divorced James Vinal, left wife divorced him. She married Alfred S. Wise, who are buried in City Cemetery. Ora put in first electric lights in Nyhart. The mine at the heart was at Nyhart was working for General Electric. Did one in Butte, and his brother could have moved east. Dad and stepdad Leslie Francis Vinal, they wired up a mine in the Yak. Went to in the 1890s. Unfortunately, that mine didn't work out. But in the 1890s, they rode on horseback from Butte to the Yak River. They hauled traffic for the Northern Pacific Railroad, utilizing Clydesdales and Percherons, and the draft horses joined a homestead. They joined their homesteads together on Pine Creek, Kootenai River. No fish in the Pine Creek, so they planted some fish, and they lived on fish and chickens. In 1905, Easybrook married the boss's daughter, and would eventually become the supervisor of Libby, and transponded to move to Flathead, Kalispell, worked for the Northern Pacific, and landed a land grant. He worked for the Forest Service. Anyway, in $400 in 1935, he bought a block. Personal, I can't read my writing, unfortunately. He sold corn for added cash. His mom would give Keith a lot to build. House on Paxson, he built in Paxson, was moved to Florence. Keith started building Southwest 3rd Street. He moved to Missoula after leaving Forest Service, worked Northern Pacific land development. Keith built 108 houses in the 30s up until the 50s and 60s. Grandmother Phyllis, when she was 5 years old, she came to the area from Nebraska in a covered wagon, and she eventually married Leslie. Her Leslie Francis came to 19 years pump in the silk. Mom's house square. Okay, and Allison spent the summer hauling buckets of water to the house that was up above the creek. Right now, I'm going to... In 1940, she married Bill Easterlin, Lawrence H. Easterly. 33 years she spent in the South Francisco Bay Area. This is Allison, Keith's sister. World War II, she worked for the War Department and stayed on with friends. Keith went to L.A. in the 30s. His sister Elaine went there first, and he came there later and lived in a guest house and worked for the War Department. And Fort Mason was where Allison worked, and where the ships came in, soldiers left. Was under the Garden Gate. Bugs married to Elaine and made money in Alaska. Allison moved to Bay Area in 1939. Elaine preceded and married a Greek. Keith moved to the basement at Elaine's house in Los Angeles. Keith and Elena Keith's sister Elaine had married Bugs by that time. Keith would be working for Lockheed in the late 30s. He had learned how to read blueprints when he was going to the University of Montana. Keith Gilson Vinal, April 12, 1905 to 2009, August 24th. His ancestors were Pequod, as he explains it to me, and there's a Vinal Haven Island off of the coast of Maine where in the latter 1800s, Keith's dad was working to mine in the granite quarries where they'd build 14 by 14 and 20 foot long and like square pieces of granite which they would hammer off. They were extracted from the quarry, and the corners were hammered off of the edges so they could put it in a lathe, and then they could utilize the lathe to build columns and so forth for the builders like the banks and so forth and libraries or whatever in New York City. The large stone cutting lathes that turned the columns and pillars of industry loaded onto sloops rigged with masts that are built like barges. Keith's dad, Leslie Francis Vinal, took advantage of the newly built railroads and took the A train, so to speak, and he arrives at the station in Butte, Montana. The 1890s, James Vinal arrives shortly thereafter. Leslie Vinal's mother divorced her first husband and married Alfred S. Weiss. James Vinal's brother left James' dad's brother, Ora, works for the General Electric after he designed lighting system for a new mine in the Yak. This mine was washed out, so Ora went back. Leslie Francis Vinal and Alfred S. Weiss go back to the Yak on horseback. They homestead 2 properties, one is built near the Pine Creek. Brook trout are placed into the creek, 2 homesteads back to back. They lived on the fish that were planted and chickens pretty much. The barns were identical barns were built of tamarack. Ora put in his electric system in the Nehart mine at Nehart, built for the General Electric. Keith told me that there was a water wheel up street that powered 12-volt electric lights. He said that before the fire of 1910, they put water sprinklers on the roofs, to keep the buildings from burning. A 2-story on one end and a 1-story on the other is built. 2 sisters playing with matches and a second-floor closet create a conflagration, and a new 1-story house is built. It's sort of a square house, and it's built not quite as extensive as the house was. It was more utilitarian. Keith's dad and stepdad and Leslie Francis Vinal went into the 1890s to the Yak on horseback, where they attained 2 back-to-back homesteads. They arrived in the Yak and used Clydesdales and Percheron draft horses to haul freight for the Northern Pacific Railroad. Eventually marries the daughter of the owner and the horses. I recall Keith discussing how the owner of the dress horses was hornswoggled by the brothers of a comely partner, and she pretty much led him down the garden path. He wound up following her on the railroad, and they wound up, her brothers wound up and acquired the Clydesdales and Percherons, and nobody really heard from his grandfather. He just sort of disappeared. Some bank robbers stole money from a Libby bank, and while on the lam, they dropped a pistol before they left with some stolen chickens. When the money ran out, the ne'er-do-wells took a train back to rob the Libby bank. A very perseverant sheriff is able to shoot them all down while, I forget the guy's name, but Keith told me about it. He said he shot them down while at the same time he was shot. But he loaded 2 pistols and just dead-eye aim. The sheriff prevailed as well as survived. I think there was 5 outlaws that he took down. Keith talked about him and his dad riding in a vintage Dodge the roads of the Forest Service, which he managed for the forest. And a bear moved too slow, and Keith's dad slowly bumped the bear in the butt, the posterior. The bear took an offense to that and swiped and removed the radiator off of the car, and they had to send back to Spokane for a new radiator. No, and then they waited as his dad shot over the bear's head to move it along. He didn't want to get it ticked off and shoot it. But Keith tells about the saving of the Ross Cedar National Forest off the Bull River Run between Highway 200 and Highway 2 in the north. There was some kind of a back street deal from some outfit in Spokane that were going to harvest all of the cedars, and his dad didn't think that was right, so he shot out the radiators of all of the equipment and maybe other parts of it, and so he got in some trouble for that, and I think that's what ended his career. Keith recalls he also purchased a used vehicle which wasn't allowed by the Forest Service. That might possibly have also worked on him moving from the Forest Service to the Northern Pacific Land Management. There was a lot of railroad grants that were an incentive for people to build the railroads. The homestead, In those days, everybody ran a still. Keith recalls rye whiskey available from a jar at the table or a pitcher during Prohibition. All the stills would distill their products in Prohibition, and they would deliver them into a logging truck that was used. It was a hollowed inside, and they transfer as much alcohol as they could, and that would be driven to Butte to feed the thirsty speakeasies in Butte. If the revenuers showed up, a coded crank of the old telephone, bring, 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 would warn those with stills to put out the fires, because that way the only way they could find him was watching the smoke. Keith's dad, Leslie Vinal, worked for the Northern Pacific Land Grant Management. The Vinals moved to South 3rd West and lived in a triple duplex owned by someone named White. However, before moving to Missoula, Allison recalls spending the summer hauling pails of water to the homestead above the Waterline Creek. And the second-story house, after being burned to the ground by the two girls playing with matches in the closet, they built a cabin square, and it was down closer to the water, and the other house was up above the water, and that's where she would load the buckets up, and they didn't have pumps in those days. The house was replaced with a tamarack cabin. And getting back to Missoula, Keith recalls scrounging half-pint bottles, which he sold to the bootleggers because he'd find them and he'd rinse them out and sell them, and he made some money. He would walk around the town streets and alleys, and he sold brass, steel, and copper to what would now be called recycling. He said that worn-out brakes provided brass. The railroad always left enough coal piled in the yard so the people could put it in wheelbarrows and use it to heat their homes during the Depression. Keith recalled the Pacific Fruit, which up until the 80s was actually on a railroad siding and just north of the tracks. But the Pacific Fruit Company allowed people to remove vegetables and other fruits that were too far gone to join in the system. They might even be a little bit rotten, but they could still eat them. His mom's saving money enough to pay $400 for land around Paxson, Agnes, and Ernest Street, and one sharply shaped part of the land was sold to add to the money they had. Keith's dad moved to Kalispell and managed much of the railroad's land grants, acres eventually winding up on South Street, 3rd Street West, in the triple building owned by a man named White. In the 30s, Keith's mom purchased the area that was sold when she would let Keith acquire a lot and build on it. He sold all of his 108 houses built on a handshake. He never had a contract. And Keith leaves the fold when he voted for FDR. That's when he joined his sister Elaine in Los Angeles. He was able to get a job at the Lockheed as he could read the blueprints, a skill he acquired from 2 years of pre-engineering. Allison commented that all the girls went to college at the University of Montana, and that's less connected to duties of navigating the land grants of Northern Pacific Railroad. And the $400 from Keith's mother introduced the lots as needed. Keith was working in the late 30s for Lockheed Air. He wired the cockpits of P-38s and other airplanes. He also performed with his trombone and a band that joined with Women's Air Corps. The songs parodies of current hits that sometimes became too racy upset some of the people. Keith, at one time, when I knew him, at one time in our friendship, had an LPA turntable, with speakers and so forth. And he played some of the big band songs and started dancing by himself, waving his finger with just a big smile on his face. He told me about Duke Ellington's hiring him to play trombone to fill in for a musician that couldn't make it for the Black Mikado. Keith tells of playing along with for different gigs for Duke Ellington, and one time somebody stole his tires, and he tells of him taking him home to his house, and the next day they went to someplace where Duke Ellington knew somebody and they were able to get 4 tires and put them, and he purchased the tires, helped Keith taught, and that was it. Keith taught civilian Air Corps to pilot airplanes when he was in Phoenix. He was at Luke Air Base, and he trained pilots to ferry airplanes to help manage the war, like the Russian pilots who flew planes to Sweetgrass Airstrip. These planes were then towed across the border to Canada due to treaties, and then the girls would fly the planes to Siberia. Keith spent time in the Biloxi, Mississippi, eventually after bringing a friend to... Actually, when he was working for Lockheed, he was keeping his deferment, but he brought a friend, Bud Murdahl, who injured himself surfing, and he didn't like the medical facilities in L.A., so Keith made a soft and firm spot for him in the back seat and drove him to Missoula, and he recuperated from that. And so Keith enrolled in the Army Air Corps at that point in time, and he eventually flew planes to an English air base and in North Africa. He recalls he would always, they called him Grandpa and he was the oldest guy there, and he was 20 something. He would take a broomstick handle and he would climb up on a ladder and double check to make sure the tanks were filled, because the gas gauges weren't really accurate, and he didn't trust them. And he actually was involved in some airstrikes to the Pulaski, I think you pronounced it that way, oil fields, and they were responsible for flying a big sortie over the Mediterranean to the Romanians' oil fields, and they bombed them. After the war, he demobbed and took the train back to Missoula. He started an air club with some partners. Oh, I forgot to mention that there was one group of a squadron that was on one of the bomb runs, had a heavy tailwind and overshot the base, and years later they found the planes and the skeletons. But I get back into getting back to Keith. He started an air club after he demobbed. He took the train back to Missoula, and did some work around here, and he was building some houses. He worked at the Star Garage in the 40s. Worked with his brother-in-law. Owned it, and he talked about working on cars and filling up some of the many hookers that lived in Front Street, and pretty much all the hotels that are that are brick ones that you see in Missoula. At that time, they were all brothels, pretty much. And he talks about those, and talks about how he told me how he would keep track of the books, and he said he never actually got a salary, so what he'd do is he'd write an IOU and he'd put and his brother-in-law would do the same thing. And when he was selling stuff back when to backtrack a little bit, he kept money in a vase on the where they lived in Missoula when they first moved there, and when he was earning money, and he actually said just take money out and put an IOU in, and of course they did, and he never asked anybody to pay any of the IOUs. But he took the train back to Missoula, and he started an air club eventually after he'd been working for the Star, and then he'd been building some houses, and he started flying as a teen, trained by Bob Johnson, who would turn off the ignition as the tri-motor Fokker approached the runways. There used to be the runway used to be in the old Sentinel High, where the Sentinel High School is now. That's where the airport was. Keith had to be an excellent pilot to survive from his teens through the war and eventually his retirement in the 90s from flying. Keith could look at the sky and tell you what the weather was how the weather was and what it was on the way. He told me he built 108 houses by himself as the head carpenter, as the owner of the business, actually, contractor. He'd helped innumerable projects in and around Missoula. He built Bugs Barbecue, a thriving business. Because at that time you weren't supposed to build anything, so they started out with the papers as it was going to be a chicken coop, and it, of course, became Bugs Barbecue, where his sister Elaine and her husband Bugs ran for years. And he talks about how his sister Elaine made the best pies. Everybody came from all around just to eat some of the pies that she made. And this business was run for years in Missoula. It's in the same place now where Denny's is. That's where it was. Keith worked for his brother-in-law at the Starlight Garage, pumping gas, doing mechanical work. He would make calls with the tow truck, and he one time saved a person's life who had fallen in a pond. And as he was hauling that person out, and Keith brought to safety because he got kind of stuck in the ice and it was cold. He could have died, and he got some help from a highway patrolman, and he survived the hypothermia. The patrolman couldn't swim, so he bent down a sapling, and Keith grabbed it and got out of the water. I saw the clipping of it. There was a clipping that he had in his scrapbook that talked about how he got an award, and there was a picture of him, and he actually there's photos of him and other pilots in his scrapbook, and he built a gull wing trainer after the war that he flew around. He paid about $50 for it in surplus. He flew it for several years. And he had another airplane. I just was talking to his son today, and it was I forget what he called it, but it had an upper wing, and Keith and his friend would take it and use the ski. He'd put the ski underneath the head of the coyote. When the coyote turned around, his friend would shoot him with a 410 or a 910. And there was a bounty on pelts and on coyotes, and so you could sell the pelts and collect the bounty. He made about, I think, $8,000 that year. He said that was a lot of money to make. And his friend would shoot the coyote, and then Keith would land on the saddle and then go up like this, and then these little stops would come out and stop him from turning. And then when he'd get ready to go, he'd throw the pelts into the plane, and then his friend would turn the plane around. Then he'd have to run and jump through the door to get into the airplane, and then they'd fly back to their base of operation and empty out the coyotes and got them all set up so they could turn them in. he claimed he made about $8,000 and as his share of the bounty in that year. He reminisces about all of his true life adventures. Allison, his sister, is the last of a string of pioneer family that moved into Butte, Libby to the Yak, into Montana. Keith's mom came to Montana at the age of 4 from Nebraska in a covered wagon. They talked about delivering milk to the Bonner Ferry from the homestead. They had 2 back-to-back homesteads, and they had pretty much matching barns. And the list goes on. Keith Vinal, may he rest in peace. I know he will be missed by all who have ever met and gotten to know him. I can vision Keith flying his gull wings airplane even as we speak somewhere in the spirit world. In the skies of the spirit world, God bless you, your soul, and may it rest in peace. The world has lost a true gentleman and person of character. Vaya con Dios, amigo, happy trails. Lately, Keith was turning up electronic parts of new model automobiles. He said that he tuned Allison English airplane engines at Lockheed, and utilizing the oscilloscope, he had about 24 different deals here. He was working for an outfit that has a dealership here, and they have electronics that needed to be tested, and basically he'd test all the 24 of them, and then they'd print out and whatever needed to be replaced. And he'd do that at night and on the weekends because he couldn't stand the cigarette smoke when he was working with other people. He didn't want to have to deal with that. While in the Air Corps. On my days off, I would drive over to his house and ring the bell, and we'd go to McDonald's or somewhere else like Claim Jumper for coffee. I'd find his red truck, and then we would sit there and solve the problems of the world as we saw it. Keith would relate parts of his life he led. He was born in Libby and lived with his family on one of 2 homesteads that were set back to back. He would tell me of wiring Lockheed airplanes, how the P-38 fighter was produced, how the first engines were rotating in the same direction so the plane would just vroom, go down in flames. And I guess they lost a bunch of test pilots, and then Allison engines, one turned counterclockwise and the other turned clockwise. They would maintain balance, and that would keep the plane from going south. He talked about the trombone he played in the evenings, how the Palladium had 16 sides and the hardwood floors. There was 2 hardwood floors, and the top one was separated from the bottom one with a bunch of hard rubber balls that just covered the floors. He said you had to dance as the floor would bounce. If you didn't, you would fall over. Keith enjoyed his life to the fullest. Being hard of hearing, he still was able to converse if you sat on his left side. He was licensed to fly twin-engine planes. He instructed pilots at Luke Air Army Corporation in Phoenix, Arizona. He talked to me about the 15 to 16 and 17-year-old Russian girls who would fly airplanes to Sweetgrass, where they'd tow them across due to the treaty, and then he'd fly them from there to Siberia. They're probably gassed up in Alaska, I'm guessing. They were filled up and flown across the continent to East Siberia airstrips. He told of one pilot who, for some reason, was impatient and didn't warm up the engines enough, and she wound up crashing a plane into some trees. Keith traveled to Biloxi, Mississippi for a while when he was in the service, and his wife, Florina, followed and worked for a power company. Eventually, Keith wound up at a British air base in northern Africa. He said he was called Gramps due to being older. He was very smart. He didn't trust the fuel gauge. He would take a ladder up to the wing and he would use a broomstick to measure the amount of aviation gas. If it wasn't full, he wouldn't fly it till it was. He told about the liberators flying on a mission to Ploiesti oil fields where they bombed them. He was very sincere in his sorrow of the bombing of women and children. He was also very sad about the utilization of the atomic bomb in World War II. He had very strong feelings about that. He talked of a squadron catching a tailwind flying past their airbase. Years later, the planes were found on the Sahara Desert with all who served the landing were found skeletons. He talked about taking the train home after the end of the war. He worked for his brother-in-law in the Star Garage, and he talked of the hookers and the FBI arresting for some reason, and he was told by them to stay away or he'd be shot. He told of taking tow truck calls and being told by the highway patrolman who stuck a pistol in his nose. The cop extracted $50 for Keith to tow the vehicle. He talked of Bud Myrtle being moved to Missoula, and we discussed that. In Keith's car, Bud Myrtle eventually recovered and was a driver of the bus town for the prisoners, unquote, from the Italians. He talked of his flying club, and he was good friends with a lot of people, and how he had a room at the New Florence Hotel that he kept just because he was keeping things fixed and stuff. And in exchange, he knew the guy that owned it. It was a Canadian that came over that had been a commando in World War II. And John Hayden, I think his name was. In exchange for a room and board and a bar tab, he would fix plumbing. He kept the rooms in good shape. He painted them and stuff. He talked of Dennis Washington taking over the building of the Knoxon Dam after the person that originally did it couldn't handle it, and so that's what put Dennis's business on the map. And Dennis bought a Cessna for Keith to fly himself and a few of the other riders from Missoula every day, and Dennis had just used a Caterpillar to cut out an airstrip for him near the dam, so that was a good deal. He was an excellent reader of the clouds and when not to fly, when the land purchased by his mom would run out, she would have Keith build on another lot, later on another lot. That's pretty. And Keith used a table saw purchased in the 46 that he still used today. He had a friend who owned a D8 Caterpillar bulldozer. Keith said his friend could cut level areas and dig foundations like an artist. One day the FBI showed up and claimed his friend owed taxes, which he might have. I think it was $200. Put him in jail in Butte. Unfortunately, his friend owed $200, and his friend hung himself in the jail before Keith could get there and pay off. And Keith paid it off to the IRS. He helped out the man's family, wife and children for years, as I understand. Keith to this day still is angry about the raw deal. Every house was built on a handshake. He built a house that the buyer kept adding additions, wings, and a swimming pool. And when the buyer went belly up, money-wise, Keith's friend Bud Myrtle showed up with a little suitcase valise with $35,000 in $100 bills and bought the house. And it was a fair deal for both sides. Keith talked of starting a house without a building permit. When the inspector would show up, he would just slip him a $50 bill and the inspector would leave. He built 108 houses himself, and worked on numerous other houses by other people. And Keith is, I met Keith back in '94 when I was working for JC's telemarketing for people to buy winter clothes for kids that were misfortunate and their parents couldn't afford them. And I used to listen to him. He'd tell these great stories, and we eventually became friends. And I pretty much, when I had a day off, I would make it a point to stop over, and we'd go out and have coffee. And like I'd say, solve the problems of the world. Keith's always going to live on with all the people that know him. He'll be in their hearts. And pretty much that's about all I can say. Could maybe see if I can find some of the other facts. Because yeah, Keith was born on April 12th, 1905, Keith Gillison Vinal, and he left this world's corporal existence to the spirit world in 2009, August 24th. God bless him. Thank you.